in the middle of the box.
No, we're now being recorded. Okay.
Very good.
So, welcome everyone. I was asked to give a informal talk about some of my ideas. This is a preliminary, some preliminary ideas of, I think, things we can collaborate on. But I decided to give a somewhat broader talk introducing the concept of fractals in many different contexts, including the ones I'm working on. I want to essentially rewrite or re-express fractals as a relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic sizes. And to do so, we're going to go over three types of fractal, essentially. I'm going to share my screen briefly, just a sec. So can you see my presentation?
Yes,
Okay.
perfect. If you put it on presentation mode, it gets better.
Okay, so it is working now. Okay. So the overall idea is, what do these three objects have in common? And these represent three types of objects that can attain a self-similar shape. And self-similar shapes, in the limit where you have structure at every scale, are fractal. So fractals are good approximations of many objects in nature. Fractals are also very interesting by their own intrinsic merit as mathematical objects, and they also arise as models from physics. So we're going to explore briefly these three types of fractals or fractal-like objects. And I'm going to use examples of things I've been working on, things I'm interested in, not because I believe they are the most impressive ones, but just because they're the ones I'm more comfortable talking about. So to start very briefly, fractals in nature or self-objects, self-similar objects in nature. Go on.
You are showing the presenter's view to us, which makes it a bit awkward to follow.
Oh, so I'm presenting the wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
No, it's wrong, but it's the presenter's view.
So I'm presenting the wrong screen.
The wrong view.
Yes.
Yes.
So if you go to display settings and swap, no, okay.
Okay, so I'm going to share the second screen. Okay, now is the right one,
Yes,
right?
very good. Yeah.
Okay, so these are examples of these three objects, and we're going to go through each one in turn. So what I'm going to say is fairly elementary. Probably most of you know about this, but since I want to reach as broad as an audience as I can, I want to make very clear, hopefully, the fundamental concepts I'm using and how I'm defining fractals. I'm going to go from the very basic, which is the first idea of Mandelbrot of how long is Britain's coastline. And I think this is a good analogy of the sort of my own work, in the sense that you find out that the question you ask first is not actually the most fundamental question. So the real important question is not how long is the Britain coastline, but rather what's the relationship between different types of sizes of this coastline as a function of the type of rule or the size of the ruler used to measure. So the idea is that we start at some point, say Aberdeen, and you define a certain ruler of the size of this blue line, and you see how many of those it takes from Aberdeen to the south of England. Now, if you take a ruler of a different size and you try to follow the same coastline, you find some indentations, some peninsulas and bays that the previous ruler could not find. And it takes, even though this red line is half the size of the blue line, it takes more than 6 of these red lines to cover this coastline. So if you look at this as a size of a coastline, as a function of the size of the ruler, you actually find a relationship, a power law relationship that varies from coast to coast. So if you want to say what's fundamentally different between the coast of Britain and Norway and Australia and Brazil, it's not really its length, but rather how its length varies as you change the fundamental length ruler they use to measure it. Different, more irregular shapes have a more aggressive relationship between those two. In a power law, in a log-log plot, these usually take form of a linear relationship, which means we have a power law relationship, which means that these two points are related by some exponent. And this exponent in this case is what we call the fractal dimension. The fractal dimension quantifies the relationship between the length of the ruler, and I don't mean the size of King Charles, I mean the size of this fundamental element we use to trace around the coastline, and the total length of this coastline. Now, to put this in perspective, that's where I started. We have cerebral cortex. This is the biggest structure in most mammal brains. It's purely mammal structure. And we started by asking ourselves how the cortex folds. And I'm going to connect that to fractals shortly. And the answer is that it crumples. It crumples like a paper ball. So if it starts from a paper sheet, like an A4 size, and you split it in half, have an A5, then A6, A7, and 8, a bunch of self-similar objects. And you can crumple them and generate families of paper balls. Now, why is that interesting? It is interesting because it immediately comes to mind that to quantify these paper balls, you need three quantities. Two of them define the intrinsic properties of this sheet of paper, its total area and its thickness. And the third one is one that quantifies the size of the resulting paper ball, which we can also quantify as an area, as exposed area. Now, these three quantities, they don't express everything about the paper ball or cortex, but they do express a great deal. And when we use those three quantities to express a cortical shape, and when we develop a mechanical model, as we have developed a statistical physics derived model for the shape of the cortex as the equilibrium between the axonal elongation mechanics, dynamics, and the self-avoiding nature of cortical surfaces, what we do is effectively minimize the free energy and express in terms of those variables and doing a bunch of approximations, we find a theoretical relationship between the total area of the cortex, or its intrinsic size, the size of the cortical sheet if you were to spread it out, the exposed area of the cortex, the area that's exposed to the outside, and the thickness of this cortex. And this relationship can take these two equivalent forms, where K is a dimensionless quantity. And this relationship is very suggestive. It's very suggestive of a fractal relationship, but it was not derived formally as such. Empirically, this relationship bears out for essentially every mammalian species that have data for. It's a very precise relationship, which means that we have found a universal law relating extrinsic and intrinsic sizes of cortex for species that are both geophytal, have folds, and lysocephalic, which they don't have fold. So this is, in a way, very, very interesting, but asking ourselves how the cortex folds is actually not the most fundamental question one can ask. Because, okay, the cortex is folded, but what exactly does it fold into? So a more fundamental question is, what is the shape of the cortex? The answer is that's complicated because some cortex are big, some cortex are small, and we try to express all these very complex shapes in some unified way. But using that universal law, we can show that cortical shape is universal. That law that is valid across species, across individuals, healthy adult human individuals, and across cortical regions. It also is going to see valid across length scales for each individual cortex. So this fundamental idea, this fundamental relationship suggests a fractality for this cortex. Why is that? Because we can express that universal relationship as a measure of its intrinsic or total area as a function of its extrinsic, exposed or extrinsic area, measured by this unit tile that has an area of the thickness square. So the idea is that you can have this fundamental tile, and you see how many of those it takes to cover first the total area of the cortex, then exposed area of the cortex. And you find that across different species, and that's key because we're not talking about a single cortex across scales, but different cortex at the same scale, we find this power law relationship. Now, this is the sort of relationship one finds in fractal objects or in approximations of fractal objects. And if that were the case, then the 5-fold exponents would be essentially half of the fractal dimension. Now, this doesn't prove the cortex is fractal, but strongly suggests that they are. So, like I said, the key here is really to find what's the most fundamental question one can ask. So when you say what's the shape of the cortex, is it fractal or not? We have to look at the full diversity of shapes that we find, and we find that some are small and some are big, and some are folded and some are smooth. So does the universal law account for all of them? Yes. Do all of them correspond to some sort of fractality? Not quite, but all of them, as we're going to see, correspond to some sort of self-similarity. So let's look at two of these cortices, that of a cow and that of what people call sea cow or manatee. They have about the same size. Those two animals are about as bright as one another, but the sea cow, the manatee, has a very smooth cortex. The land cow has a very folded cortex. So what's the difference between those two? As we're going to see, the only one significant difference between those two is that the cortex of the sea cow is much thicker than that of the land cow. So in this fractal framework, what we're saying is that the fundamental tile that one uses to paper over the sea cow brains is much bigger. It's the square of the number of times the thickness is bigger. So we have fewer of those tiles, and therefore, again, we have a smaller total area. Let's see if that holds true. Now, what we really are hinting at here is that how the cortex folds is not a fundamental question. What is the shape of the cortex is not really the fundamental question. The fundamental question is what are the shapes of cortices, or to be a bit more precise and more verbose, among all possible geometric structures, which one may correspond to cortices, and that's where we can find the answer, and we can actually say with confidence that those are fractal or self-similar shape in the following way. We can examine one single cortex at different scales. We can delete structures that are smaller than some set fundamental or fundamental scale and vary the scale so that we eliminate folds and gyri that are smaller than this. And as we increase the size of the scale, bigger and bigger folds are being eliminated until you get something that's smooth. If we make a movie out of various melted cortices that we can generate through this process, that's what we get. That's a human cortex. The left-hand side is the gray matter, the outside of it. In the left, we have the white matter that lives inside of the gray matter. And as we increase the scale of this erasure, as we increase the scale that defines the largest structure that we're going to preserve, this is what happens. It melts. It becomes more smooth and proportionally thicker. And we have done this for 11 different species of primates. The paper is literally just out. It came out on Monday. And what we found that cerebral cortex is indeed a fractal. Or to be more precise, because fractals are abstractions that only exist mathematically, the cerebral cortex is a good approximation of a fractal. What we mean by this is that if you look at this relationship between the intrinsic and extrinsic size of these cortices, measure in units of the thickness, and as we melt these 11 different cortices, we can generate a movie from each of those. And if you line up the frames of each movie and connect them by these color lines, each line corresponds to different species. We see that first we get these linear relationships in a log-log space, which means that we have power laws. Second, all these power laws have the same slope. And third, all of these power laws not only have the same slope, but they also coincide, or at least they seem to follow the same trajectory. So what's saying here is that the cortex is self-similar. The big folds are similar to the small folds, but not only that, measuring the proper unit, which is the thickness, a big fold in a human, a big fold in a chimpanzee essentially look the same in a well-defined statistical sense. So what we're saying is that all of these objects approximate the same archetypical fractal. We cannot express these relationships as the total area divided by some fundamental area, which is proportional thickness square, is a parallel of the exposed area divided by some fundamental for the same fundamental area. And the exponent that relates those two is the fractal dimension divided by 2. The 2 is because that's a topological dimension of areas. And we find that to a very precise degree, this fractal dimension is 2.5, exactly as the model predicted, but more importantly, it's the same for all these different species. Which may lead one to ask, okay, so what's the difference between my cortex and that of a chimpanzee, of a giraffe, of a whale, or a kangaroo, or whatever? And the answer is that, like I said, these are not fractals, they're self-similar objects that approximate fractals. And the key then is, for which range of sizes is the approximation valid? And we can show that for humans, this range is fairly broad. For chimpanzees, it's somewhat less broad, and as we have less girified brains, they become increasingly less broad. So this is a way of describing cortices that are both smooth and girified in the same framework. You can say they both approximate a fractal, but for the smooth brains, the range of approximation collapses to a point. So effectively, we don't have sulci and gyri, you just have one smooth surface. And this range of scales is different from different species and also different individuals. So that's the main morphological difference between my brain and that of a chipmunk. Maybe it may sound a bit humiliating, but essentially we're saying that there's one single way of folding a cortex, and nature follows this iteratively over many scales, and the range of scales that nature or natural selection chooses to fold a cortex is essentially what's going to define its gross morphological qualities. Now, this means that all morphological quantities can be expressed as powers of the girification index, the ratio between the intrinsic and extrinsic areas. And that doesn't explain everything about a cortical shape, but explains quite a big deal. Now, this is very interesting, but it also has applications in human health that I'm going to go into briefly. But I just want to connect this to the topic of this talk, which is fractals with objects that have varying fractal dimensions, varying self-similar parameter scalings. And what we see empirically is that the fractal dimension of cortices seems to be very much an invariant across species. It seems to be about 2.5 in young humans and old humans, humans with Alzheimer's and humans which are healthy, in humans and different species, and also between different regions of the human cortex. But the fundamental scale, the size of the smallest structure, as a multiple of the thickness, it does vary slightly. We see that the fundamental scale is the thickness squared divided by this k to the fourth power. So this quantity k in an exact world will be an invariant across all cortices, and it's almost invariant. But we see that this quantity decreases slightly over aging, and also where it's massively decreased, or not massively, but it's somewhat decreased for patients with Alzheimer's. In a way, we can say that Alzheimer's is an accelerated morphological aging of the brain on account of this result. So we can compare, for instance, one single cortex across different scales. Essentially, we start with a cortex in its native scale and we melt it, and we can see how these quantities varies, this k, or A0, or the total area and exposed area. And in a world where this universal law was precisely applicable over all scales, we would find that k would be exactly the same across scales. That's almost true, but not exactly true. So that's what we find. We compare humans that are both young and old, 20 years of age and 80 years of age. And we see how k varies with scale. So the scale is essentially the size of the smallest structure that we preserve. On the right-hand side, we see these melted brains for different scales. So you can see how they become smoother as we increase the scale. And we see in the blue line and the red line how the respectively old and young humans this k quantity, or in fact the log of k, varies across scales, and the variation is very small, but it's there. But the most important thing is that they have very different shapes. So we know and have known for some time that the K is much higher or somewhat higher in younger brains than older brains. But as it turns out, as we melt the brain, for scales of order 2 millimeters, this relationship inverts. So the K becomes larger for 8-year-olds than for 20-year-olds. What we're saying is that the fundamental tile in young people for scales, for small scales, is smaller than the fundamental tile for older people. It's just slightly smaller, but measurably smaller. But if you look at an approximation of this cortex where we melt away the smaller structures, older people have now a larger tile on scales greater than 2 millimeters than younger people. These have implications for our understanding of age. It can also be used to measure age, and we hope in the near future we can use this to generate biomarkers for both age and Alzheimer's. But it shows how deviation from exact fractal scaling, in this case not a fractal dimension, but the fundamental scale at which the fractal approximation becomes valid, can have implications for human health. Now, this is what I work, so that's why I went into this at such detail, and that's some work I'm really excited about, but also illustrates how fractal approximations are present in nature, and how understanding how these approximations are valid or not, or when they're valid or not, and when you have deviations from this fractal nature, can also be significant. Now, if you look at this in a more in terms of biomarkers, it means that we can just use this quantity that derives from this self-similar scale to differentiate between a younger and old brain and a healthy and a diseased one. Now, these are fractals in nature. They're never really fractal, but they can be well approximated by them. But there's such a thing as fractals in the mathematical realm. So let's talk about exact fractals. And that's essentially the heart of this talk, in the sense that that's the thing I really want to present to you as a potential idea to collaborate on, or at least to discuss, is the idea that we can define this mathematical object, this fractal, in an exact manner by approximating these abstractions through iterants. So that's what we do. Let's start with something simple. This table, the table I'm currently sitting in, it does have a length. We're going to call this the extrinsic length, but most people just use the word length. They are not wrong. Now, the fact is that the length of this table does not really depend on the ruler size in any meaningful way. I can use big rulers and say 1/3 of this length, and I use 3 rulers, or I can have 6 rulers of half length. And the product of the number of rulers times the size of the ruler is always the same. The exponent is 1. So we can say the fractal dimension of this object is 1. This object is not really a fractal, because there are such things as fractals with integer dimensions, but this is not one. But what about area? And, well, it's in Portuguese. Well, you can have this tile that has 1/4 of the area and 1/2 of this of the width and height, and it takes 4 of them to cover this table. Now, if you take a tile that has 1/16 of the area and 1/4 of length and width, well, it's going to take 4 times as many. And this can go on and on and on as much as we like, but essentially the number of tiles is the ratio between the extrinsic size of this table, the length of the table, and the length of the tile. And the power is, in this case, simply 2. You can express this as area to 1, but these are all very uninteresting relationships in the sense that the scale doesn't really matter for the sizes. But these allow us to define the way I want to define fractals, as this relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic sizes. This relationship is trivial in this case of a table, but not so much in the case of objects that have structures, a detail at ever decreasing scales. So let's look at a Koch curve. How do we generate this? We start with a segment of length 1. We delete the intermediate third of this segment, and then we take 2 segments of length 1/3, and we connect them to this two orphan segments that we generated so that they meet in the middle. So we essentially complete the two sides of this equilateral triangle. Now, this generates an object that has four length 1/3 segments. And we can reapply this procedure to this four lengths so that we can now have an object with composed of 16 segments. And we can iterate this repeatedly, and we can generate a family of shapes we call iterates of a fractal, which is the limiting case where the number of iterations goes to infinity, the number of segments goes to infinity, and the length of the fundamental element goes to 0. Now, we can numerically compute the size of the fundamental length, the number of those that takes to cover the shape. And by implication, the extrinsic size is, in this case, invariant, the distance between the start and endpoints. It's also always once. And the intrinsic size was the product of these two first numbers, the number of rulers times the size of the rulers. And in general, this can be expressed as powers, the end powers of some number. So a relationship between those intrinsic and extrinsic size divided by the size of fundamental ruler can be found. And it's a simple computation to show that in this case, this is the ratio between logarithm of 4 divided by logarithm of 3. That's 1.26. Now, the advantage of using intrinsic and extrinsic length rather than the number of tiles as a function of the size of the tiles, which is the essence of box counting, is that we can obtain these objects in a different way. We can start with some fundamental element, with a fundamental object with 4 segments, with a fundamental element of size L0, and without varying L0, we can just glue 4 of these objects together, then 16, then 64, then 256. So in this case, what we're varying is not the fundamental size, but the extrinsic size. And we can see that in both cases, we have essentially the same relationship between these two quantities. What is being iterated here doesn't matter. What matters is the relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic sizes. And in this case, in this exact case, the fractal dimension is always the same. Now, how can we generalize this? Well, that's very simple. That's something I came up with a couple of years ago to exemplify fractals of different fractal dimensions and how we can understand them. And the idea is that the higher the fractal dimension, the more structure arise as you increase the resolution at which you observe an object. In the case of a table, nothing arises when you increase the resolution because the tables are boring. But in this case, the fractal, the Koch curve, they do generate interesting new structures. And how we do this? Well, we start with a segment of length 1. Then we erase a middle segment, but now we define a number we call phi that's going to be erased. The length of this middle segment is going to be erased. And in the case of the Koch curve, this number is 1/3, but we can vary this number between 1/4 and 1/2. Now, in the place of this segment we deleted, we're gonna put 2 new segments, and they have the same length as the orphan segments to the left or to the right. So we're gonna complete a triangle that's no longer an equilateral triangle, but we're gonna generate an object that does have 4 segments of equal length. And this is, of course, the length of the fundamental unit. And it's a very straightforward process to essentially count the intrinsic size and extrinsic size as a function of both phi and the fundamental length. And what we get is a relationship between the fractal dimension and phi. Now, in the right-hand side, I've generated a number of these objects for phi varying from 1/2 and 1/4. In the middle here, we have the Koch curve with the usual 1.26 fractal dimension. But as we make this phi smaller, the triangles become narrower, and we have this something that looks like an electricity pylon. And in the limit, we have these very narrow triangles that almost meet in the middle. Going the other way, as we make the triangle broader in the base, we generate something that looks like a cauliflower. but increasingly it generates less and less structure because the triangles are shallower and shallower. And to understand this, you can look at the limiting case. The limiting case where phi equals 1/2, essentially what we do is we have a 1/2 segment here, and then two 1/2 segments going up and down along this vertical middle point, and then another 1/2 segment going to the right. And as one iterates this, we generate this triangular shape that is essentially covered by a regular lattice, where the size of the lattice is fundamentally the size of the smallest iterate that you chose to represent. So in the limit where you have a fractal, well, this fractal is essentially, or this object, self-similar object, is essentially not the entire area, not all the points encompassed by this triangle, but a dense set of this triangle. Essentially, any neighborhood within this triangle is going to include an infinity of such points. So if you just think of this as a box counting problem, if you do a box counting, how many boxes, how many squares you want to use to cover this object as a function of the size of the square, well, this number is going to increase to the square of the linear side of the square. So the fractal dimension is exactly 2. The other limit is when this length is 1/4, because if the length is okay, this is correct. If the no, this is not correct. So I have inverted it. So no, this is incorrect. I'm gonna apologize for this. I'm gonna share my screen shortly because I'm gonna actually move to Mathematica now. But this is when phi equals 0, and this is when phi equals 1/2. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen now, but now I'm going to move to Mathematica so I can see this happening. So I'm not going to keep the presentation now. So when phi equals 1/2, it means that we are left with one segment of length 1/4.
I think it was correct. It depends if phi is the angle or if it is the position at
No,
which
it's the
you are
length.
putting the angle.
Yeah. So phi is the length of this black arrow.
This segment.
Yes. So this is phi. Okay. So if phi equals 0, essentially we go from the leftmost point to the middle, and then up and down, then to the rightmost. If phi equals 1/2, now we have a 1/4 segment to the left, 1/4 segment to the right, and we have to complete a triangle of base 1/2 with two length 1/4 sides. So the only way we can do this is if they all line up. So you see that as we iterate this process for phi equal 1/2, we start with a segment of length 1 and we end with a segment of length 1. So this is a fractal dimension of 1. And in between those two, we have all fractal dimensions between the embedding and the topological dimensions of this object. That's, I think, something that's cool. And I can show it to you in a graphic way if you just look at Mathematica, which is how we like to do these things. So we can start with the oh my goodness. These things never work when you want them to. I'm really sorry for this. Just a sec. Okay. So let's start the Koch curve. Now, like we said, the way we generate this is by iterating this process, but first generate one triangle, then 4 triangles, and so on and so forth. And we can see that as we change shape, the shape factor is phi, the fractal dimension, as illustrated in the top, changes. So we start from this dimension 2 to dimension 1. And if you want to see this in a more in a 2-dimensional object, we can obtain something like this. So we have a polygon, and we iterate between something like this to something like this. Now, This is a variable dimension fractal. Like I said, something that's very simple. It's a fractal that essentially it's measuring lengths. Now, it would be interesting to be able to generate fractals that have areas, and those are harder. But I managed to figure out how to generate those. And I apologize, these last slides are a bit rushed because essentially I did this calculation this week, so I couldn't really, didn't have time to generate really decent slides. But this is what we get. And I'm gonna apologize in advance for just throwing pictures in here. But the idea is that if we, let me see. So are you seeing the correct screen right now?
No, we are like before, seeing the one that you see.
Okay.
With the next one.
Okay, so let me do it again. So my idea of generating an object of, say, topological dimension 2 that has a varying fractal dimension is to start with a square and deleting aspects of portions of this square and then iterating this process. And the way I do this is interesting because it iterates between two well-known fractals. So this is the idea. I'm gonna actually draw on top of this. So we start with a square, again of side 1, and we define two quantities. One is this length here. We're gonna call this A, and the other is this length here, which we're gonna call B. Now, these two quantities are not unrelated to one another because as we produce a cross and put that in the middle of a square with this shape, we want this length and this length to be the same, which means that we now have segmented the remaining part of this square into 8 unequally sized squares. The ones in the corner, which are bigger, and the ones on the side, which are smaller. And now, as an iteration, we put in each of these squares a properly proportioned cross, like we did before. So now we have essentially 3 different sizes of this cross, and the ratio between the size of them depends on A and B, but A and B are not independent, so essentially depend on one parameter. I won't show the formulas here, but they're not particularly hard, but I didn't do the plot, which I should have. But essentially what we find is, and again, I'm sorry for literally drawing on is that A can vary between 0 and 1/3. And as you do so, the fractal dimension, which I'm going to put here, the fractal dimension varies. So when A equals 0, essentially this is infinitely narrow. This cross goes all the way from the left to the right and to the top to the bottom of this. And as you do the same thing for the other crosses, you see that what we're doing essentially is generated a regular Cartesian grid. So the fractal dimension in this case is going to be 2. In the case of fractal of A being 1/3, B equals 0. It's easy to show that. So essentially you have a square, I would delete a square in the middle, and then 9 equally sized squares on the sides and corners. And it's easy to show that in this case, the fractal dimension is not far from 2. It's about 1.89, which is the log of 9 divided by the log, 2 times the log of 9 divided by the log of 8. No, 8, 9.
Log 8 divided by log 3.
Yeah, essentially, yes. Or 2 times log 8, log 9, yes. But in the between, for A, in between 0 and 3, we can actually see that this quantity dips, not a lot, but to about 1.6. And this happens when this third iterative cross has exactly the same size as the fourth iterative cross that's going to arise in these corners here. So what we have is essentially a fractal dimension that is not monotonic on the size of A, but it goes down, then up. That's what we're going to get. And let me see if we can. So the limiting cases are this. Fractal dimension 1.89, or about 1.89. We have something, there's a name, someone's carpet. Do anyone remember?
Sierpinski.
Yes, that guy's carpet.
Sierpinski carpet. Yeah.
Yes, that's it. So in this case, the cross, it's a degenerate cross. That sounds more religious than it should, but essentially have one square as a degenerate cross in the middle. We have 9 smaller squares around it, and then surrounding each of those 9 have other 9, so that we have 81 and so on and so forth. Now, in the case where the second order iterate cross has the same size as the fourth order iterate cross, we have a very, very similar idea. We have a cross in the middle, then 4 cross in the corner, and then we have 20 cross in the third order, and then this number increases by a factor of 5 at each increasing order. This is called the Jerusalem cross fractal, because the Crusader King of Jerusalem had a flag that looked essentially like this. Small variations. And when the fractal dimension is equal to, we essentially, the cross degenerates into an infinitely thin cross that goes across the full width and height of this square. And we have something that looks like this. It essentially is a Cartesian grid. And for the same reason that the triangular grid that we got from the generalized Koch curve has a fractal dimension of 2, is also going to have a fractal dimension of 2. So by varying this parameter A, we essentially have a fractal dimension 2 for over a range of about 1.6 about 2. So those are the ideas that I think are key for me to present. I'm going to finish very briefly talk about statistical fractals, simply because that's another situation where the fundamental length or the fundamental dimension of these objects change. But I'm not going to go into any great detail over them. But we do know that there's such thing as statistical fractals, in the sense that they are not exact copies. They're not exactly self-similar in the sense that the smaller structures resemble bigger structures, but they do resemble them in a statistical sense. And when we have a model for something like Brownian motion, as the path, say, of a drunken person moving either to the left, the right side of the street with equal probability. Wait, that's not what I want. When you have something like that, we know that the number of steps and the total extrinsic distance that's traveled related. The total distance traveled goes to the square root of the number of steps taken. So we can think of the number of steps times the length of the step as the intrinsic length of this trajectory. Let's go over this way. My screen has frozen. Okay. As the intrinsic length of this object, and the distance between the start and end point, the total length traveled, is the extrinsic size. And it's a very simple calculation to show that the expected value of this extrinsic size goes to the square root of the intrinsic size, and therefore the power law exponent is 2, and the fractal dimension is 2. That's true for any dimensionality of the embedding space. So that's an interesting case of a fractal that has an integer fractal dimension. Now, why is that interesting? It's interesting because something resembling random walks appear repeatedly in nature and not only in Brownian motion. And we can generalize this idea by essentially applying a force to the endpoints of this trajectory. And in the following way, consider an RNA molecule. So an RNA molecule is something that has a repeated patterns of nucleotides. We can think of this as akin to this. We call this réguas pedreiro in Portuguese. I think in English, people call it the articulated builder's ruler. So it's something that has a number of segments of constant size. The segments can be oriented, in this case, in 2 dimensions, in the case of RNA, in 3 dimensions. Now, as it happens, we can count how many ways one can generate a certain trajectory, either in the RNA molecule or in this ruler, as a function of the length of the ruler. And we know that if the ruler is fully extended, every one of its segments have to point in the same direction, which means that there's really only one way in which this thing can be fully extended. Now, if it's contracted, then there are more ways we can fold it. And we also know that entropy is essentially a logarithmic measurement of this number of microscopic states that corresponds to one macroscopic state. We know further that this gives rise to something called an entropic force. So it means that this object, when subjected to a thermal bath of a finite temperature, prefers to be contracted than expanded, so that it's going to exert a certain force that's a function of the extension length. And this force is going to go to 0 as the extension length goes to 0. This entropic force is proportional to the temperature. And we can imagine that in an empirical apparatus, we have something like an optic trap that exerts force on a bead that has been glued to this RNA molecule, so that there's a potential, effective potential, that attracts this bead to the middle of this of the strap. So as we move away from the center, this conservative force associated with this potential increases. But since this is contracting the RNA molecule, the entropic force is decreasing. Going the other way, if you move towards the center, the conservative force decreases, but the entropic force increases. So there's going to be a balance between those two, where those two forces are in equilibrium. What this balance is the point where the free energy, as defined by this difference, is minimized. In equilibrium, on average, the entropic force is in balance with the conservative force. That's a very specific way of viewing free energies in this case. But that suggests that we can actually make a statistical physics model for this binomial chain, where we approximate this RNA molecule by one of these rulers. And it's easy to see that we can further approximate this by a composition of random walks on 2 orthogonal axes. In this decomposition, these random walks are independent. So we can talk about the coordinates for the red random walk as steps to the right or to the left, and steps and the blue random walks as steps to up and down, and look at them independently. And we can calculate the number of configurations, a simple binomial problem, and we can define an entropy here. Now, this entropy is going to depend on 2 numbers. It's going to depend on the number of steps, the intrinsic length, and it's going to depend on the distance between the endpoint and the start point with the extrinsic length. We call these R and L. So we can essentially find that this entropy can be then expressed as a function of these 2 quantities, and a small a ds can be expressed as the dm and dn, and this steps for these 2 lengths. And the derivative, the partial derivative we get, are essentially forces. What forces are those? Those are the entropic forces. So we can calculate the entropic forces for one such chain that has been extended by a length r, and we can find the symmetric forces for one such chain that is left open to the heat bath and can vary its intrinsic length by adding new segments to the heat bath or withdrawing them. And you see that in both cases, this can be calculated exactly for the binomial chain. And in the case of the extrinsic length, is the best analog to something like a rubber band. We see that we have a force that saturates when the lengths become the same, both the right and to the left. And in the middle, where the length is small, it can be linearized, and we can use this to calculate something like an elastic constant. Now, why is this interesting? It's interesting because we can then write this as an ensemble, and I'm sorry, I don't have a slide for this, but you can derive this as a different ensemble, not this microcanonical ensemble we use to calculate this entropy, but as a sort of a canonical ensemble where the chain is allowed to exchange length with a length reservoir. And we can calculate the force, we can apply force to the end points of this chain and calculate the length that one obtains. And what we find is something very interesting. I have this in Mathematica somewhere. So if you bear with me for just one sec. No, it's not here. Okay, I'm going to just briefly describe what I find, because it's not really hard. The idea is that as we change the length of these objects, we have something that interpolates between fractal dimension 1 and fractal dimension 2. So for smaller lengths, we have the average length is dominated by the fluctuations, and the fractal dimension is close to 2. It's exactly 2. But as we have a chain that has larger and larger lengths, as we apply force to the different elements of this chain, it becomes more and more stretched, and the fractal dimension approaches 1. So that's one way we can get a fractal dimension of 2. I just want to finish, and I swear I'm just about done. I just want to go back to the variable dimension Koch curve. I just want to show something that is potentially relevant. The idea is that we can generate these objects with different fractal dimensions, and then we can calculate the fractal dimension using box counting. And that's just a word of warning that I implement this box counting explicitly for different iterations of this Koch curve. And we also measure the fractal dimension using box counting. And of course, this doesn't work. Okay, I don't know why it's not working, but I'm going to finish anyway. And what we find is something that we find that no, what's going on? Is that the box counting fails for fractal dimensions close to 2. So when we're estimating the fractal dimension of these objects, we have to use methods that are a bit more powerful than box counting, and that's something you have to bear in mind. So I'm just going to finish with this variable Koch curve here. I just want to say this is the kernel of what we're trying to discuss. We can generate fractals that objects that have fractal dimensions that vary between 1 and 2, and that may be interesting in a potential collaboration. So I'll end here, and I'm sorry if the end of my talk is a bit less structured than I had hoped, but I had just finished this calculation this week, so I didn't really have time to generate more slides. But I can send you a presentation that looks a bit more finished a couple of days from now, so we can actually look at those things I have described. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you for your patience. And if you have any questions, I can answer any that I can.
Thank you. This is wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Very, very inspiring. I would have 3 hours of questions, but I will not be able because I have to go to the next meeting. But just one thing very short, because I am afraid to forget. Are you aware of something called the Hill thermodynamics?
No, I'm not.
So there is a book about Hill thermodynamics, and also Rodrigo
Can I just
did part.
interrupt you very briefly? Marcus asked me if you can email me. Please do. Contact me whenever you want, whatever you want. I mean, Christiane has my email if you don't. I'll be very happy to talk afterwards.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Then I'll have to leave now.
Maybe we will need to schedule another meeting for discussing,
digesting
and discussing further, because that would be great. Because I have another, now I'm already late, but let me just tell you, when you talk about a reservoir that can add length, that's precisely what Hill thermodynamics does.
Is that so?
Yes. So Hill thermodynamics is a way to treat finite size systems, which are small. And then what you do is you consider a big system composed of many systems of a small volume. And now the way to change the total volume of your system is either by changing the volume of the individual system or by adding more subsystems.
Yes.
And this is a way to get into some thermodynamic normal equations, which can now take into account nonlinearities and give up on its extensivity. So we have been using this to treat topological systems where you want to separate the bulk from the boundaries.
So in this very simple model, this binomial chain model, the way we calculate, I calculated for the microcanonical, even for the microcanonical ensemble, they calculated exact, so it doesn't have to go to the thermodynamical limit, and we can actually, I can show you. I have it somewhere. Here. So we can calculate the forces, and the forces, they have this blue term here, which essentially goes to 0 as you go to the thermodynamical limit, but you don't have to take that into account. So these are corrections for small size in this exact case. And in the case of the canonical ensemble, the same thing is true. I can calculate exactly the partition function for any length, for this length reservoir, and you can also find the small size corrections to get this interpolation. So yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting idea. I never heard of this thermodynamics, but it's similar to some ideas that I've had.
We have been working on it for a few years now for these topological systems. I could tell you more about, but you should come to visit us, Bruno. You should come here and spend a few months.
Well, that would be wonderful. I mean,
we should try to get money for that and start organizing it.
Let's do that. I can bring my bike.
That would be super ideal. So let me do something. Let the others ask questions, and I will have to leave here because my other meeting has also many people waiting. Thank you infinitely much. So Robin and the others, just feel free to ask, and please, you send us the The recording, right?
Yeah, I will send you the recording and also the presentation once I polish it a bit more because the end was a bit rough.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
You can talk to him, you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yes. So, Bruno, hey, can you hear me well?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thanks for a very nice talk. I have a few questions related to the part of statistical fractals.
Yeah.
So first, maybe this is a bit of an out of equilibrium point of view, but I was wondering how can you actually calculate these partition functions using, for instance, microcanonical ensemble if you are a system that is coupled to a stochastic process, such as a Brownian motion, or well, it can be whatever heat bath. So, I mean, shouldn't you have certain type of inequilibrium state to use these arguments?
Yes, but all these calculations are done in equilibrium. I mean, they're very simple. I think essentially approximating this whole system by this, so that each length has a choice of going to the left or to the right. So the partition function is essentially these two states that, so it factors into each segment having to choose between these two states. And if you have a term that makes one direction preferable to the other, that's what we call force, then we can calculate the partition function as a function of this unevenness, and we can derive a non-zero mean length for that. So I'm going to write it up and send it to you because I have the impression that you think this is far more sophisticated than it actually is. It's a very simple calculation, but they all done.
No. It's just that I mean, you have a probability function that it's changing in time somehow.
Okay.
You have something that it's driven by a stochastic process, so you should have a probability function that it's varying in time. So you can actually use these arguments to calculate the partition functions and everything.
Yeah. But why is it varying time? I mean, I'm not explicitly modeling the heat bath where this thing is in. I'm literally just calculating probability. I mean, assigning probabilities to different states. That's all I'm doing. Okay. So each segment has a probability of being to the left or to the right. And the probability is the same, then you have an exact a drunken walk or a random walk in one dimension. And if there's a not, then you have something that generalizes it. And as I have shown, and I'm going to send you a picture as soon as I can find it. It's somewhere in my hard drive. As you add more length elements to it, as if this probability is greater than to do the right to the left, then it starts to it gets stretchier and stretchier, and the fractal dimension approaches 1. But you have few segments, then the fractal dimension is close to 2. And the reason for that is that the extrinsic length, the distance between the start and end points, it has two components. One component is the average length, or the square root of the average square length, and the other is the variance of this. And the way the system is derived, this is an extensive system. So the average length has to, the average length, the intrinsic length has to be proportional to the extrinsic length, at least the average value. So all the fractality comes from the fluctuations, the variance. And in particular case of the Brownian motion, where the probabilities are the same and the average length is 0, all the travels are done by this fluctuation, so that we have the square root of the variance as the extrinsic length. That's why the fractal dimension is 2. But as you increase the size of this object, then then the length dominates, and then you approach fractal dimension 1. You can see this very nice interpolation, but I have somewhere in this bloody hard drive, I just don't remember where. So I apologize for that. I'm going to send you a picture of this because it's really cool. You just see this laws being interpolated as the length changes. And again, I stress, it's a very simple calculations. I have done a more sophisticated calculation using a variable angle. Qualitatively, they give you the same result, but they don't have neat analytical formulas for that. So that's why I presented the change.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay, maybe I have another question.
Sure. Yeah, hello.
So this was about this variable dimension Koch curve. You showed the formula for its dimension as a function of this phi.
Yes.
And I was just confused by how you got there, because this is like the log of scaling, or log of the number divided by the log of scaling, right? But I couldn't see how 1 over phi was the scaling in this situation.
Yeah, I got the feeling that phi was defined as the intrinsic length over the extrinsic length, and that wasn't reflected correctly in the graphic. So that would give you the correct values.
Let me put up the PowerPoint here. So I'm going to put the presentation mode. So let's go for over here. So this is the formula you're puzzled by, right? So let's just go.
So we are seeing thing right now.
So let's just go over some limiting cases. When phi equals 1/3, right? Phi is a length, okay? So it's this length here. When phi equals 1/3.
I don't think we're seeing the right screen.
So say that again?
I don't think we are seeing the right screen.
Oh, you're not? Damn it. I'm terrible at this thing.
See a Mathematica.
Okay, let's go back. I'll put my screen on and thank you. Now you can see it, right?
Yeah, now I see the presentation.
Okay, so this is the dimension. So phi is this length here. Okay. Now when phi 1/3, this quantity here is 3. So you recover the usual Koch curve fractal dimension. Okay. Now when phi equals is this correct? No, yeah, this is incorrect. Sorry. So phi goes from 0 to 1/2.
I think the graphic is wrong. I think phi should be defined as L0 over LE over the extrinsic length.
Not
that would give you the right formula for the dimension.
So if phi equals 1/2, okay, so it's going to be log 4 log 2, which is 2. So that's the correct fractal dimension. Okay, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Okay, I'll write it up and send it to you. But I have this correct formula. It's just that I put this here from memory, but I will send you the correct formula. But
yeah, no, it makes sense
if
the scale between LE and L0.
Yeah, maybe. Yes, I think you're right. Yeah. Yeah, I think this should be just this. This makes more sense, right? Because no, actually, no, it's going to be the product of these two.
Now, LE over L0.
Yeah, the same thing. Yeah, so LE over L0, something like this. Yeah, that makes sense, right? Okay. So in this case, when this is 1, this is 3, this is 2, and this is 4. Yeah, you're correct. Yeah.
Okay. And then if we go to this 2D limit, yeah, exactly. Then you get LE is equal to 2L0 log 2 over, or log 4 over log 2. And
Okay.
yeah, okay. Yeah, I was just lacking some intuition there, but now it makes sense.
Now it makes sense, right? Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
I just have one more question. I'm on the other side of the room. When I saw the title of your talk, what I thought you were going to talk about, like I loved your talk by the way, but what I thought you were going to talk about is fractals with locally varying dimensions.
Okay.
So
multifractal.
Multifractal. Okay, apparently there's a word for it. But I could imagine, for example, in your RNA molecule on sections that are straighter compared to other sections, the fractal dimension is locally lower.
Yeah.
Is this anything you've spent any time thinking about?
Yes, I'm going to give you 2 examples here. So that last example that I couldn't find a bloody mathematical file that essentially it's an object that for small lengths has a fractal dimension of 2, but for big lengths a fractal dimension of 1. So in a way, it's a multifraction that interpolates between the 2 fractal regimes. And if we want an empirical case, that's actually interesting because I told you that the cortex is a fractal, it approximates a fractal. And over all the scales, the fractal scaling is very much the same. But if you look at the cerebellum is on the back of our brain, and the cortex is something that exists only in mammals. Cerebellum exists in all vertebrates, and it's always folded. So a shark cerebellum is folded, a bird cerebellum is folded. And so one could generalize this model that I have for the cortex for the cerebellum with the difference, which is that the cerebellum is folded in only one direction. It's like a sheet that goes like this. So you can take a medial cut of the cerebellum, and instead of trying to model a surface within a volume, you model a contour within a plane. And we generalize this model, we obtain a fractal dimension of 1.5. Now, there is a recent paper we published this year. We actually examined this in empirical cerebellum for many different types of mammals. And we find that that's not true. So if you look at the larger scale, the exponent is 1.8. If you look at the entire cerebellum. And as you move down and down because you can actually very neatly separate the order of the fractal by the branching of the cerebellum. As you go down and down to the orders, this exponent goes down until asymptotically to the last level, it goes to 1.5. So it's only asymptotically fractal like this. But in between the various scales, the fractal dimension equivalent changes between 1.8 to 1.5. So yeah, that's, I think, something that has a fractal dimension that changes with scale. That's how we normally say it.
Yeah, I think this is actually a known term. This is multifractality.
I know. Not usually defined in those terms of fractal dimension varying, but I'm somewhat familiar with it.
Yeah, so the multifractality is basically that you find a different dimension depending on the scale.
Mm-hmm.
So that sounds very much like the same concept to me.
Yeah. So yeah, I see lots of points of contact. So it's like I said, a fractal. So an object is defined, that approximates a fractal is defined by 2 quantities, by the fractal dimension and by the fundamental length, which defines the smallest size for which the approximation is valid. And it's really interesting to be able to quantify both. And in some ways, in some objects, the fractal dimension changes with scale. And in some other objects, this fundamental scale changes with the parameters of the model. So one other model that I haven't had time to present is a very similar one to the binomial chain where we apply a force to the chain. But now the force is proportional to 1 over the number of elements in the chain. And the end result is that you get a fractal dimension that's always equals 2, but the fundamental length is modified. So instead of fundamental length being the size of the segment, it's that number times 1 plus the force times the inverse temperature times the fundamental length. So that's another way of can have a very fractal by changing a parameter. If this is too vague, I will write it up and send it to you because I'm just waving my arms right now.
No, it's fine.
It makes sense. But this is, you're talking mostly about fractals that change dimension as a function of length scale, no?
Yes.
What I guess I was thinking about more is fractals that change dimension as a function of position. So, or I guess of the number that parameterizes.
Oh, position.
Yes.
They change dimension as a function of position.
Yes, I'm not sure there's anything that prevents that.
Let's say maybe an example. On the left side, your dimension 1.5, but on the right side, your dimension 2.
Okay, I can give you an example of, it's not a change in fractal dimension, but a change in scale, which is the actual cortex. Because as I told you, the fundamental scale is given by some multiple of the thickness. The cortex actually changes thickness systematically between different lobes. So it's thinner on the front and thicker on the back. So we can actually see that this fundamental scale changes with different lobes. Now, I haven't seen a fractal dimensionally, the dimension change or the exponent changing with area, but that's something that may arise in different conditions. Zika is one potential candidate. We've been trying to analyze Zika brains for a while now. Delineating the boundary between white and gray matter is hard. That's why I haven't been able to. But it may be that regions that are more affected by Zika have different fractal dimensions. So that might be an empirical case.
Right. Because I feel like your RNA description,
yeah,
it's also bound to happen that straighter segments of your RNA have a lower fractal dimension than more crumpled segments, so to speak.
It may be, yeah. In fact, I mean, it may be just by dint of statistical fluctuations, but also because we know that different nucleotides have slightly different mechanical properties. So in principle, you can have an RNA that has a certain sequence. I don't know, this bit here has more adenosine and the other bit here has more guanine. Then it may be that this bit is stiffer than the other one, and then you can have different fractal dimensions. That's a speculation, but that's something maybe turn out to be true.
Right. Food for thought. Thank you.
Cheers.
Anyone else?
Cool.
Okay.
Possibly. Protein folding, yes.
I think we've run out of questions for now. So yeah, thank you for the nice talk.
Thank you very much for the
we will keep in touch.
Yeah, let's keep talking. Yes, we should do that. I'll talk. I mean, email me directly because I want to talk to you as well. But I'm gonna try to coordinate with Christine about a follow-up to this, and then we can see if we can show up there and cycle around the Netherlands. Okay. Bye bye, my friend.
All right. Thank you.
Bye. I have to end.